Hola y bienvenidos al podcast Un gato en tierra de perros, vuestra referencia para la política estadounidense, la cultura y mucho más.
Hello, I'm Joe Magaha. Thank you, friends, for being with me for another episode of Un Gato en Tierra de Perros. I have with me a friend of the show, Mr. Brooks Crenshaw. Welcome back, Brooks.
Hey, Joe, great to be with you.
Great to be with you too. Happy Fourth.
You as
Almost.
well.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward
Thank you.
to it.
It's been a weird. Well, it seems like every week is a little weird these days in the news cycle. But I'm glad I waited to talk about Iran because a lot of podcasters kind of hopped on right away to give their opinions on it, and there were a lot of subtleties to what happened over there. What's your
Definitely.
take on the bombing, and then on the subsequent response and where we are?
Yeah, so I would say I'm relatively on the fence with regard to skepticism. I ultimately support the strike. I tend to think that that's within Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, with regard to presidential power as commander in chief. I don't want us involved in any prolonged or boots on the ground context. I think Trump's response here recently to both the Israeli and the Iranian government when he dropped the big F bomb on live television, I think that set a proper tone that made me a lot more comfortable with regard to where we're going here, because I think that signaled the fact that, hey, we did the heavy lift you couldn't do. You're on your own, essentially, from a tactical standpoint. So, yeah, I think we'll see, but you know, I think ultimately it was a good strike. This is where I disagree. My Congressman Thomas Massey, I think he's a great congressman, and I agree with him 99% of the time. These are the types of issues where we tend to misalign. I understand his argument, but in the original read of the Constitution, it was the original verbiage was Congress shall make war, but they changed the verbiage because it was felt that hamstrung the commander in chief with regard to imminent and limited military action. So, declare war as a prolonged, protracted campaign, I think, is a proper contextualization of the dynamic at play. Plus, the fact that war as a definition has evolved immensely in the last 2 centuries, and now we're in this peculiar murk where China can be leveling economic, cultural, propaganda warfare, and with no kinetic action really, but it's still with intent to destroy the system that is their adversary. So, what is war today? I certainly believe that protracted kinetic warfare should be declared by Congress, but in this case, I think Trump gets this right.
Yeah, and you mentioned China. I wonder if China played a hand in terms of um, slowing Iran's role, because, of course, Iran's big move in response could be to close the Strait of Hormuz, which would basically damage China more than it would damage us. We have goods that go through there, but most of our goods come the other way. Do you think that they stepped in, or had communications with them at all to try and maybe tamp pressures down?
But I think China is going to exert its influence in any way possible on either side of the campaign to project its interests. Really, I really think the high level dynamic at play is this large proxy, almost world war, where the larger nations are playing, you know, with and against the smaller nations as almost outsourcing casualties in a sense, and keeping it in a much more controlled bottle rather than all out war in the kinetic sense. So, yeah, I believe Russia and China are both playing all hands that they can play in order to further their interests, and they should. I as a you know, it, it, I'm an American and I'm pro-American and I want America to win. But objectively speaking, I think that all nations spy on all nations, and that's just kind of a fact of life. When I hear Israel spies on America, yeah, we spy on them too. We also spy on Qatar. Qatar spies on us. Like that's just a human universal. So, yeah, the big nations are going to play these games.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned about Congress, Congress really hasn't declared war since World War II, right? So it's been, a while, and
Right.
we've
So
had a few wars since then.
in the post World War II world, we've things have gotten a lot murkier, and part of that is there's a dynamic at play here that I really am uncomfortable with, which is with regard to incentive structure. Uh, you get the behavior that you incentivize, and we have long-standing international agreements in the post-war, you know, globe that you know we must treat prisoners and combatants humanely if they are wearing markers that denote them as combatants and do not use human shields and human and civilian infrastructure as a human shield. The problem that occurs is that over time those privileges are extended universally, and when you do that you negate the incentive to follow the rules, and we're seeing that play out now. Things like public execution for treason is something we don't do anymore, so you incentivize that behavior. So all the barriers to bad behavior that were instantiated in the post-war world have slowly eroded to the point that the bad behavior no longer has the barriers.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think I mentioned I'm offline when we started that, much like Kelly, who we've had on the panel before, I'm anti-war, but I'm not anti-surgical strikes. And this seemed to be a surgical strike rather than a a knockoff or something that would blow up and escalate into a war.
Yeah.
And we didn't really know, and a lot of people were up in arms, including Congressman Massey, because of that. Because most actions require a reaction, and it could blow up, and it's a dangerous thing, particularly for our ally Israel. But our ally Israel is not really listening to our counsel these days either, which makes it difficult.
So a comparison can be made here with regard to tariffs, right? I'm I'm not for war. I'm not for tariffs. There's a time for both. I tend to view Trump's strategy as if it's a short term. So if we're striking Iran to prevent larger war in the future, um, and it's a reasonable strategy, if he is seeking to implement tariffs in order to negotiate parity, thus reducing the net number of tariffs across the world, that's a reasonable strategy. But it becomes a shit strategy the longer it runs, because and this is both with kinetic and economic. Like the longer the campaign runs, the more it descends into all out war. And so, that's the rub.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, it looks like Israel has really changed its status in terms of its popularity in the West within the past few years with what's been going on in Gaza, and a huge part of that is just the accessibility of video on the scene, cell phones. People are getting, so there's video on TikTok, on YouTube, all over of children being massacred, and it is really brutal. And it's not the only place it's happening in the world. Of course, there are brutal massacres in Africa that we never see because they don't have access to that, and in other parts of the world as well. There are whole tribes of Native Americans that are massacred all over the Americas that never get talked about. But because of this, I think that a lot of young people, of course, young people see it as a binary situation, good and bad, black and white, and they don't see it as any more complicated than that, and they don't really have a reference to history either. At Glastonbury, I think it was just yesterday or over the weekend, over the past few days, a rapper came on and was chanting death to the IDF, and from the river to the sea, inshallah, and people were waving Palestinian flags. You would have never seen that 10 years ago, or much less 20 right after 9/11.
Right.
I don't know where we're going with, it seems like in the West, populism is really taking over, which is, I think, a good thing for the most part, because basically populism is what brought Trump into office. He wasn't wanted by the establishment Republicans, but populism on the far left is a much different thing. Like with the guy who's running for mayor of New York now, and
Right.
other areas.
The naked communist.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of it's becoming extremism on both sides to a certain extent, and that can kind of make things make the stakes higher, let's say.
Well, there's a lot of strategy at play here. So regarding the first issue that you mentioned, public opinion is a key center of gravity particularly for forces that are fighting from a position of weakness, like Iran and Hamas. And so Hamas has been perfecting a strategy across the last 18 to 20 years. And a key demographic for them with regard to creating friction points in the court of public opinion are sympathetic Western women, particularly sympathetic American women. And this is a problem because any of us, when we are swayed in these dynamics, whether for Israel or against Israel, are vulnerable to becoming puppets of those strategies. And so we know that, many American pundits, a non-trivial amount of American pundits, are on the payroll of the Israeli government, the Qatari government, the Iranian government. We just heard last week that Nick Fuentes and what's the other guy's name? Two prominent right-wing Twitter influencers were on the Qatari and Iranian payrolls, to their eternal shame, I might add. So, teasing out the incentives of the intelligentsia and the sense-making apparatus is really critical. So with the Hamas strategy, they are using and have perfected a human shield strategy. And so when I am conversing with those that are on the other side of this issue, the problem is we're both telling the truth, right? Civilians are being massacred. The ratio to fighter casualties is not what the Gaza Health Ministry says. And so when someone is using those numbers, I have to challenge that. But I also don't believe Israel's numbers either. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. But 30 to 60% is kind of the norm with regard to, for instance, the American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years. So not playing into a nation's strategy. So in a matrix of strategies, you could really see fighting from a position of weakness with low value placed on civilian life. The Hamas strategy is going to emerge in that cross dynamic. And that's exactly what's played out. With regard to what was the second issue? You mentioned there was a
yeah. Well, basically, the kind of leftist move to take over in an extremist forum. I mean, now with the mayor, the guy who's running for mayor, he's proposing like state-run or city-run
right
grocery stores and things like that. So it's kind of going to be a blend of communism or socialism and Islam, because he wants a lot more Muslims in government as well.
Right.
Which it sounds like a beautiful future, doesn't it?
Anti-colonialist Muslim is a wild concept because, like, there's no more a colonial force than Islam, historically and globally. Yeah. So kind of the neo-Marxist strategy that's being played out here is, there's this notion of the Hegelian dialectic that you want the two opposites to ultimately clash and synthesize. So you end up with the best parts of both sides of those opposites or alternatives. And for a long time, their end game strategy was the notion that communism and fascism would rise up and meet one another and ultimately end up in a utopian system where we get the best from both sides and the state really ushers in paradise for all humanity. Um, it's been a mass graveyard every time it's been tried, but I do see the idea that, from the neo-Marxist perspective, the uh, concentration and centralization of that strategy on the left and provoking and attempting to give much larger voice to the um, portions of the right that are somewhat fascistic, and there are those, particularly along the Christian nationalist types that view the Constitution as inadequate, and we really just need to become some form of theocratic fascism. That has to be resisted from our side. We need to police. I'm a person on the right, so I need to police that on my side. But the larger strategy is that those two things have to rise up and clash so that we can usher in the new man. And so that's kind of the back end source code that's playing out that the average bear just doesn't know what's happening. That's what's happening.
Yeah, and it. I think in a lot of ways, I'm very much for these new movements that are pulling us away from the established ways of doing things, because you can no longer just throw money at an issue, because people have access to the internet now. So it's not like we just have three news stations. Um, it used to be, it still is the case that if you're going to run for major office, you have to have millions of dollars. And that really makes it an elitist move. It's not something that the average man can do. We love to think that anybody can be president, but really, if you don't have the deep pockets surrounding you, people that'll give you money, then you're not going to get there. But I there's all kinds of information coming out now about the money that's been going to USAID, the tons of money that Biden just threw into things at the end of his presidency. And it probably wasn't even him, with the auto pen,
Right.
and stuff is coming out about that. But, you know, really that kind of corruption, I think hopefully maybe will get cleaned up. But I think just like anything else, criminals find a way to get around any blockades one way or another.
Yep.
I'm wondering, in terms of power structures, where we're going. In Spain, there's a big corruption scandal right now, and everybody's trying to get Sanchez to step down. Most likely he won't. They've been trying to get him to step down for a long time. But there's also this whole, I think there's a real unhappiness on the part of citizens of where the European Union has ended up. And, they're still pushing for more war in Ukraine and all that. And we're not getting, I haven't seen any recent news about Ukraine, except for more people being dragged off the streets to fight there. Have you heard anything lately?
I have not. Um, I think we have, so power concentrates or power gets separated. And that's just, this is largely kind of the Pareto distribution playing out where, we built a system that properly separated powers in the US, but over time, those powers have coalesced. And so the decision is, do we continue that road, or do we, do some form of reset or pushback that looks more like the structure that resembles the American founding. The way I see it, I developed a political spectrum model that essentially kind of modifies some existing accepted political spectrum models that, we kind of have a choice. We can go up the cone toward totalitarianism, either on the left or the right, which that gets very blurry in the middle. I would submit that Nazism was kind of center left on that spectrum, given the National Socialism that Hitler I don't even know if I can say that word on this podcast or it'll get like,
I think we're
but
more than 5 minutes in, so
okay. Yeah.
hopefully
So,
we're okay.
the decision as I see it is we can continue down this road or we can make a return toward a smaller federal footprint. I tend to favor that because I like the experimentation of 50 unique states. There's a lot of advantage to that model in that, and I'll give you an example. In the early 90s, there were 2 states that had concealed carry as a state policy. The rest did not. And those 2 states took the risk to implement that law. And what they found was that it had actually a positive impact on crime. And so those 2 states that took the risk allowed all the other states that participated later second mover advantage, meaning they could implement without the risk. And this is exactly the way federalism should work. Add to that the fact that even in the universal sense, there where 2 states took the risk and the other states um, inferred lack of risk in movement, you have states that are completely different, either culturally, geographically, industry clusters, et cetera. So one state's policy won't work in that other state. And so that other state has to craft a unique experiment that is native and relative to its competitive advantages. So, that's what makes things complicated. And when you place a federal overarching policy across all 50 states, you've essentially contaminated each petri dish with the same bacteria. So, I think the way forward in America is to reduce the federal government's impact on the average American's life and return a lot of the decision making either to the state, to the county, to the household, and let those experiments play out properly because that's where innovation is really most leveraged.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, with our open borders over the past 4 years, the demographics of all of our states have changed, but they are rapidly changing back because but it's also the public opinion on that is mixed. I, you know, I'm always following Europe, and Europe, of course, has a similar problem with immigration where they've had a flood of immigration, but on top of that, it's Muslims, and in Europe, the Muslims have been extremely violent, and they're it's some of it is the same issue that they're getting money from the state. They're not getting jobs because they just are not jobs right now. So they're living out the state, and then they hang out in the streets and they assault people, they assault women particularly. They carry weapons, often machetes or long knives, which has really changed the lives of a lot of Europeans, Spaniards. Everybody likes to think of Spaniards as kind of macho and violent, but it's a very non-violent society. When I lived there, they talk a lot of trash, but they really are. They've gotten more violent with people coming in. We had gangs from Latin America and from the United States even coming in as well. The Latin Kings were there and took over for a while. So it is a more violent place, and I think Spaniards are getting more violent because of it. But I remember back in the 80s, as an American, I think I'm naturally a little bit more violent than Europeans, and my friends would call me a name, and I would grab them and shove them up against the wall, and they'd say, well, "What are you doing?" And, they just couldn't think of the concept of violence at all. And I said, you don't call me that, and I just give them a little slap, and that was it, But but it was just like, whoa, this guy is out of control, which I mean, here you say something in high school, even though maybe that's changed too. Maybe that was just the 80s, because now so much is online, and kids are not the same. They don't seem to be as violent as they used to
Well,
be.
there's what I would call a pathological maternalization with regard to bullying. I don't like bullies. I've never liked bullies. I believe that the best way to address bullies are to allow the bullies to emerge and then violently oppose them to talk them out of being the bully that they have a tendency to become. And when you take that off the table, it's not the desired end state that the what you would the pathologically maternalistic are seeking. It actually has unintentional, counterintuitive consequence. You were talking about, Islam in Europe and the open border here. I mean, conquest and murder of the infidel is a basic tenet of Islam. Like that is baked into the source code. The only way you're going to get that out is if you end up with an Islamic Reformation in the same way that you had a Protestant Reformation in Christianity. And looking at a human timeline, Islam, if all things are equal, Islam is due for that type of reformation. And you've got figures like Zuhdi Jasser and Ayan Hirsi Ali that have attempted to kind of push back on those pathological tenets of Islam. But this goes back to an interesting conversation that the late great Christopher Hitchens had on the Bill Maher program, when you know the the premise was posited that America is responsible for war in the Islamic world, and his response was, when the country was founded, a lot of Americans were being captured and enslaved on the Barbary Coast by the Barbary pirates, and Adams and I believe Jefferson went to their leadership and asked them, why are you doing this to us? Why are you enslaving our citizens? And the ambassador said, well, as as infidels, you are ours to do with what we will, and Allah gives us the charge to do that. And so we declared war on the Barbary pirates, and that is endemic of the history of Islam and non-Islam. So there is a nature of conquest with regard to the mass migration in Europe. It is a relatively non-kinetic conquest operation. And so that's the way I view that. The American context is unique and somewhat different. This is actually a strategy in which Democrats have been bleeding votes because of their more concentrated radical positions. And so, in order to maintain a footprint in national politics, they are largely importing the voters that will offset the lost voters and the representation within the state, representative seats. So, there's been some commentary and some proposals with regard to census operations that will negate illegal counting, so that those representative seats will realign and what would you say, equilibrate to the actual legal citizenry count. I tend to think that that's the proper way to do that, because you can't really allow that strategy to succeed. Otherwise, you'll incentivize it globally, just like this is similar to the Hamas strategy. You can't let the strategy of human shields be the dominant strategy, lest you create the silver bullet strategy that everybody will use around the world. So, in an attempt to protect women and children, you're actually creating far more violence against them globally.
Yeah, yeah. And right here in my home state of California, there's a lawsuit right now against the registrar of Orange County because they are refusing to provide the federal government with information about their voting polling rolls. And they redacted it, which makes it useless. If you're redacting it, you're just giving a blank piece of paper, basically. We need to know who's registered and that they're citizens, and it's very simple. And the thing is that there's always these accusations from the left. Whenever you question immigration, there's always accusations of racism, xenophobia, and then on the right, there's accusations that it's all criminals, which is not all criminals, obviously, many working people. But when you have open borders, then even if 1%, 5% are violent criminals, that's a lot when you're talking millions,
Right.
and it appears that Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, actively did kind of what Castro did back in the 80s, which was when Jimmy Carter said, anybody from Cuba wants to come over, they're welcome to. And he said, okay, well, you can have all our rapists and murderers. Here you go, and emptied out all his prisons. And it looks like that's what they did in Venezuela as well. And they did it purposefully to cause chaos.
Yes. That's there's a precedent there with Cuba and Venezuela, like that's exactly what happened. With regard to the American problem, America is in a double bind in that, to quote the late great Milton Friedman and of course Thomas Sowell, you can have open borders or a welfare state, but you can't have both. Pick one. And we have had historically in more recent history both, and that is a recipe for collapse.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you know, basically there's so much manipulation on both sides, and these stories are very sad when you see people. There are people being dragged off now, in my state. I'm sure all over the country that are just hardworking people, but they're not documented, and you see parents separated from their kids, et cetera, et cetera. But really, there should be equal handedness, because there hasn't been enough coverage of crime victims or other things, and an actual impact on the economy. I don't know if this is going to be a positive or negative impact on the economy, but basically, many of the people that they're dragging off the streets lately in Los Angeles are street vendors, who, for the last at least 10 years, were able to sell with impunity, and without having to have the same permits that regular restaurants did. And they were coming close to putting, and actually putting, some restaurants out of business, because of course they can sell it much cheaper, because they're not paying for permits, they're not paying for any of the things that you have to pay for generally to run a business. Um, and I mean, there was a recent video of a restaurant that was closing down permanently in the Gaslamp district of San Diego, that,
Saw that.
yeah, the owner came out and knocked over one of those carts, because he said, you're the reason I'm going out of business,
I spent a lot of time in Gaslamp. I was stationed in Coronado for almost a decade, and we would hang out a lot in the gas lamp. And so, actually, a buddy of mine is getting married, and he's spending some time in San Diego, and he was asking me about where to hang out, and I was like, I haven't been there in a while, but gas lamp was always a good time. And then I saw this video, I think it was 2 nights ago, that you're mentioning, and it was just chaos in areas of the gas lamp that I am well familiar with. So like I kind of understand the picture. And so I sent that to him and said, maybe hold off a little bit on the gas lamp, and texted him that. But yeah, it's wild. The problem that we're having now with regard to the folks that you're mentioning getting wrapped up is the cost of a policy is sometimes baked in to the response to that bad policy. And I'll give you an example. You know, in, say, for instance, drug policy, when the state infantilizes its citizens and says, we prohibit these things, you're not adult enough to use these substances. When you do that, you create a generation of infants. And the cost of removing that is baked into the initial act, because if you ever repeal that, you're going to have a citizenry that has to go back through the teenage years, right? So if for some reason heroin became legalized tomorrow, you would have a teenage response by former infants that would create an example of experience for the rest of the population. I won't play around with heroin, because I know what happened to Uncle Jack once they legalized it, right? That is a necessity, but it's baked in on the back end to the initial act of infantilization. The collateral, as I would call it, of these operations is it was baked into opening the border in the first place. And so this is kind of a sinister motivation when you do that, because you know that any opposition is going to create collateral, and then you can actually um, capitalize on that collateral. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
that's what's going on.
I mean, for a long time, particularly during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a whole push to defund the police in all major cities, and a real drop in recruitment with police departments. I mean, policemen do make a good living, but it is a dangerous living, and it sucks to be hated everywhere you go as well. Um, I don't know. I think that a lot of the chaos that's taken over many of our cities, we've had street takeovers in LA where it's, people racing cars and partying, and it's complete chaos. People get drunk, and there's just massive fighting, and there's no cops anywhere to be seen. Um, it makes me wonder, you know, is this the future? Is this the future that we pictured back in the day? You know, I mean, we always thought, well, hey, you know, the cops are too violent, you know, and I mean, I remember the Rodney King days and the riots and all that. Um, and the cops at one point were very scary and violent, and you know, many, not all, but there were corrupt cops as well. But now it's it's the reverse. It's kind of like, you know, in Spain for many years, we had Franco for 40 years, and the crime rate was way down. I mean, I think in 19, even shortly after, when I was living there was like one murder in Madrid that year, you know, and it's usually people that knew each other. You know, there wasn't violent crime. It went sky high since then, but you know, people were more afraid of the cops and more afraid of the government. You know,
Zero crime comes at costs elsewhere, right?
yeah,
I wrote an article about this. The dose makes the poison, and you know the notion of eliminating something pathological like crime or racism is fallacious because anytime you reduce something far below low tolerable levels of the thing, you incur costs somewhere else. And so, if you think about the notion of zero racism, how would you enforce zero racism? Well, you would not only need a cop in every home, you need a cop in every mind to police that. So, you know, this is where again, Tom Sowell, you know, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so what we're looking for are optimal low levels of the bad thing. If we go on crusades to get the bad thing to zero, it's going to cost us elsewhere. And in Spain, it was tyranny. You know, zero crime came with a side of unacceptable tyranny.
yeah, and I mean, basically, in totalitarian governments, and which we're leaning towards in some areas, and we were leaning towards here for a while. They do try, if not thought control, expression control. You know, people are going to jail in Europe and in the UK for mean tweets, basically, or mean posts on Facebook. You know, if they consider it hate speech, which I think is insane. I mean, some people are going away for, you know, months or longer for saying something nasty. And it could be that it is something terrible that they said, but it's still just speech, you know, and you do that and you drive people underground. And I think it just makes the hateful that much more dangerous.
Yes, you make it sexy, you make it cool, right? Because it's forbidden fruit. This is where you know the average American, I don't think, appreciates the fact that the reason that happens in the UK is that you know the US has this unique free speech built into its constitutional structure and framework, and that is not, I don't think, appreciated enough by Americans who really don't understand what's outside the castle walls. And so the fact that thousands of UK citizens are jailed for mean tweets is indicative of that lack of a structure that preserves speech. And like you said, when you make bad speech, when you drive it underground, you make it sexy. It creates an invisible following that you can't really track. I want sunlight as the best disinfectant because the cure for bad speech, as is well known, is better speech. And so, really, this battlefield of ideas is where you really disempower inferior ideas.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, particularly around COVID, lean towards totalitarianism. Oh, we let's see how far we can go at shutting society down altogether. You know, let's see if we can do like the Chinese do and others, and have neighbors snitch on each other for going to church, for hanging out together in their backyard, having a beer together. Where's your mask? You know, um, it became psychotic and really ended up not having much to do with the pandemic and having more to do with people's views of each other. And it became a left right issue. Um, but it turned me off to a lot of people just because there was no room for discussion. It was either comply or, and I mean, people stopped talking to family members. It just, I find it really sad and crazy, but it's kind of, it's not the first time this has happened in society. This happened in the 30s. This happened, in other periods, but it's really destruction when you destroy the family unit. I'm My brother and I don't agree on many topics, but we're always going to be brothers. We're always going to be blood. We're always going to love each other, and I have plenty of relatives that disagree with me on things, but I can never imagine, unless they were really evil, bad people, I can't imagine turning my back on a family member because of a belief system that's just different from mine.
Well, so like this is an old story, right? Like there's a biblical reference where Christ says, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword, and it will divide households. It will put mother against son. It will put father against daughter, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law." And that is kind of a human universal in today's context. When you go to Thanksgiving dinner and posit the question, "What is a woman?" the room will divide, right? And it
Yeah.
will divide among people who will say the thing that will create immediate peace versus those who will refuse to cede the language in the defense of objective reality or objective truth. And there's a couple of experiments that were done. Milgram is one, and Solomon Ash is another. And essentially, the rub is you had these subjects that thought they were among other subjects that were actually Confederates that were part of the experiment that were in on it. And with Milgram, it was the one I think most people will know that the person was tasked with pushing a button that would send an electric shock, a notional electric shock to someone in the other room. And of course, they weren't really doing it, but they thought they were. And there was a supervisor in a white lab coat, symbol of authority, telling them to continue to increase the voltage to the point where they actually believed that they had killed this person, but they followed the orders. Solomon Ash, similar in concept, in that the lone subject among the Confederates was asked with the group, which of these lines, 1 through 4, is of the same length as the subject line, and obviously the subject line was equal with line C. But when they went through the line and people started saying, well, it's B, and they all agreed it was B. And when they got to the subject, 75% of the time they would go with the wrong answer to conform. And so when I was initially exposed to those experiments and their findings, I naively thought, hey, we've identified a blind spot in humans, and it's good that we understand that so we can really control for it. And it's like, no, that's been used by marketing firms and governments, and that data is useful in controlling and manipulating a large section of the population. So I tend to identify in that 25% that doesn't, I will not conform to something that I know is not right. I think it's incumbent on that 25% to really push back. And I think that's really what happens when you get a Dr. Peter McCullough or Robert Malone, who are experts in their field with, with unimpeachable reputations as experts in the field, and they're silenced. Like that's where the jig is up. And so I think that was actually beneficial because it triggered a logical response in a subset of the population, probably that 20 to 30%. And when they do that, it creates a friction for the audience where they kind of have to make logical decisions. And I think that's the solution.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, no matter where you stand on an issue like the vaccines, there should be room for discussion, and discussion and debate was shut down altogether. And every decision that affects the public, especially in a massive way, like where people can't even walk on the streets without wearing a mask. They were arresting people at the beach for, surfing or, crazy things like that. When it turned out, being in the open air and in the sunshine was the best thing for you. And mental illness went through the roof. Suicides went through the roof. Drug addiction and overdose went through the roof. Because of course, it's not natural to be cooped up in your house for that extended period of time, and the economy went to hell. Partly because we were throwing money to all these people, because you can't just make people stay home without paying them. The Chinese did, I guess. They even welded people into their houses for to a certain extent. But here, if you're telling me I can't go to work, I have to stay home, you better be giving me money because of my paycheck's gone. And that extended, all that free money we printed has extended up till now. Some people are still getting that money because they haven't been able to get jobs. And restaurants, family restaurants that were generational, are gone, and not coming back. And then on top of that, natural disasters like the fires in Hawaii, the fire in Los Angeles. Um, there were just so many things. It was almost like it was planned, because it's like, how can you destroy society and the economy in a very short period of time?
Well, I do believe that there are actors in the administrative state that have come to the conclusion that the American system will crash inevitably, and so that a controlled demolition is the best outcome. And I think a lot of those players are still in the system. I think the Trump administration, these things take time. As somebody who worked in the gubernatorial administration, like, it might take you 2 years to really get to the bottom of certain things, particularly when your own employees are obfuscating the facts in order to dissuade you from finding the silver bullet, as it were. The the COVID issue, there was federal overreach, but it also kind of ties back to the 50 unique experiments, because different states handled policy differently. In Florida, for example, Texas, they handled it properly, and so that created an alternative. This is like Elon buying X. You don't have to buy all the social media companies. You just have to have one alternative, and the rest have to kind of relax, or they will be exposed not, for doing the bad thing, where when it's uniform, it's not as readily apparent. And so, Scandinavian countries, for example, handled COVID much better, because they logically assumed that, given the high risk to the elderly, that the citizenry would protect the elderly and would then otherwise go about business. And that's what happened, and it was the better policy. So I want to see those experiments playing out, 50 of them in the US, so we can actually see what works and what doesn't. Because when you when you make something universal by force, you do away with the juxtaposition of what works and what doesn't. You can't see, you're blind.
Yeah, and I mean, there were standout people in California and other states that did say, like, the sheriff, I believe, in Riverside County, said he wasn't going to enforce the mask mandates and things like that. Um, but at the same time, now they're trying to get the police to resist or even blockade ICE from arresting people. And it's kind of gotten crazy. I mean, I'm sure you saw that vice mayor from Cudahy, who, I think she was at brunch and had one too many mimosas, honestly. but she was saying, all you gangbangers, you're so tough. Where are you out there? Why aren't you protecting our streets now? You're calling on criminals to basically run the streets and run
Yeah,
off the federal government.
the
you know
muscle. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, thank goodness Biden didn't send in the National Guard to enforce mask mandates or things like that. But I think that would have caused a mass uprising if he had done that.
And I think that's the reason that he didn't. I'm conflicted on these types of dynamics, because I kind of want there to be conflict between federal overreach and local authority. Even when I'm on the federal side of the issue, I tend to believe procedurally in that dimension of, again, Tom Sowell, the most basic question is not what is best, but who should decide what is best. This is where I can disagree with somebody in Arizona over abortion, but agree with them that I don't have really any say, because it's a state issue procedurally, and they have their policy and I have mine. So that extra dimension actually adds room for agreement when there is disagreement across an issue. And I want to see that play out when there's gun law dispute, when there's even abortion law. I might be on one side of the issue, and I might actually agree with the federal government. I still kind of think that that conflict is healthy in the experimental sense. I don't want to see the I don't want to see ICE impeded by the local authorities. At the same time, I view the conflict as potentially productive because it informs future federal strategy of, even if it's an administration I don't like, they'll say, well, based on that last time, we might not want to do that because the locals will, intervene, and we'll lose face because it'll be a standoff and we'll eventually back down. So it's complicated, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's what happened with the No Kings, which was completely organized and funded, but
Right.
a lot of people won't notice that, but uh it ended up being taken over by a lot of hoodlums in small areas, and that's what a lot of people like to push, that in Los Angeles isn't burning. It's just a 2 mile radius, but that's the heart of downtown Los Angeles, where everything happens, where all the protests happen, where I happen to work.
But it was mostly peaceful, Joe. I mean,
Oh
for the
yeah,
most, it was
yeah, exactly.
only minor vehicle fires for a 2 mile radius.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's usually the story.
Yeah, yeah, and celebrities like Moby came out and was like, "I'm on the street in LA. Look, it's violent, it's dangerous, And it's like, yeah, you live in an elite, rich neighborhood, probably a gated community. It's going to be quiet and peaceful, and you're going to hear the birds chirp. But keep laughing and see what happens when somebody takes over your gated neighborhood."
Let them eat cake, she said.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks so much, Brooks. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I hope you have a wonderful 4th of July, and keep me posted on things. Where can folks find you again?
Yeah, absolutely. On X, you can find me at Crenshaw Actual. Feel free to give me a follow. Check out my content. I'm also on Substack, Brooks Crenshaw, brookscrenshaw.substack.com. It's called the Dataless Thread. I do a lot of writing on the frameworks that built the West and some political commentary as well. I'm also co-host of the Cut the Bull podcast with Wilfred Riley and Kelly Christie. We recently interviewed Alan Dershowitz this past week. We get a lot of good guests in. And so check me out on all those platforms. And Joe, it's always good to talk to you. And I hope you have a great 4th.
Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, we'll see you next time.